All right. So this may surprise nobody, but we're in Matthew again. We've been there for like a minute, I think. And because we've been in Matthew for a while, I will buck every part of me. I will resist every part of me that wants to go through the context. I love context, but I think maybe I'm a minority in that, and we've already gone through some of the context. That said, I will just remind us, because this will become important in today's passage, that Matthew was written from a Jewish perspective for an audience primarily made of Jewish people. It was not homogenous, there were Gentiles, but it was primarily people from a Jewish background. And so the passage we're working through today, it has some harsh language, and I absolutely will address that. But when you hear it initially, just remember that in context, it makes sense, and we'll break it down together. So you might wonder, well, okay, we're in Matthew, but where are we in Matthew? We're in Matthew 15, verses 21 to 28. So if you want to pull it up on your phones, I'm in the ESV version today, the English Standard Version. Your pew Bibles are not ESV, but they're close enough. And so if you read through it, it should not differ too much. And we're looking at the faith of the Canaanite woman. And this story, it's got a couple themes that go, like I said, with the children's story today. It's got this theme of universalism and particularism, this idea of God's grace being for this small group of people, and then Jesus extending that circle, inviting people into that circle, making it more universal. And it's got some themes of what faith is like, and what it can be like, and what it can look like, and what Jesus kind of sees as noteworthy in faith. And so with that sort of intro, I'm going to get to the passage. So starting at verse 21, and Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she's crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. So, a short passage, but challenging, right? There's like lots of verses in there, and you're like, I don't know. It doesn't feel like the Jesus I know, right? It doesn't feel like the Jesus I know. And so let's go through it. We'll start verse by verse, and then we'll pull together some themes, and then we'll pull some other stories that are similar, and we'll see what we can take away from it and apply to our own lives. So we'll start in verse 21. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Whenever the Bible mentions a place, it's there for a reason. Why bother? Why is that important? Does it make the story more impactful? Why mention that he went from somewhere else to Tyre and Sidon? And so if we go back in time a little bit, we see that prior to going to Tyre and Sidon, Jesus was in a primarily Jewish region, talking to Pharisees, his disciples, and some other interested parties about what makes a person clean and what makes a person unclean. And not like germs, not like hand sanitizer, but purity and impure, like inner spiritual health kind of stuff. And the issue in that discussion earlier was an issue of hand washing before eating as like a ritual. You should absolutely wash your hands before eating if you're a kid listening to this, or an adult. But the discussion Jesus was having with the Pharisees and other hearers was not about, oh, don't get sick. It was about, if you eat without doing this ritual hand wash, does that make the food unclean? And does that ingesting that make you unclean? And his discussion landed with him turning expectations on their head and saying, what goes in you does not make you unclean. What comes out of you is an indicator as to whether you're clean or unclean spiritually. And that is not something that the Pharisees would have loved hearing. That is not something most Jewish people would have received just like without question. And so it was like a controversial thing to say. And so for Matthew, and I'm going to refer to the writer as Matthew for simplicity's sake, but for Matthew to tell us right after that conversation that Jesus went away from there and goes to Tyre and Sidon is important because Tyre and Sidon were traditionally non-Jewish territory. They were unclean territory with unclean people. And so it's the same sort of theme, right? If I'm Jesus, I'm not, but if I am, I've just turn expectations of cleanliness on their head, and then I've proceeded to go to an unclean region. It's important. And while there, he comes across a Canaanite woman. A Canaanite and a woman. Canaanite, unclean, enemy of the Jewish people. A woman, no business talking to a Jewish man of importance. And yet she does. She comes out to him, and she asks him for mercy. And, initially, when you just read half of that, you're like, well, maybe she didn't know who he was. But she calls him, "O Lord, Son of David," right? And it's possible that she had this special knowledge that maybe God gifted her, that she knew he was Messiah, and she meant Lord in that way, and Son of David. It's also possible that she didn't know that, and Lord was more of an honorific of just recognizing that this guy was important, and Son of David was just a recognition of his lineage, that he came from an important Jewish lineage. Regardless, she knew he was not a guy that she would be expected to talk to, or who would probably respond well to her if she did talk to him. And so it's a risk she takes in doing so. But she does it, and she asks him for help. She begs him to save her daughter. And here's the first thing he does that causes pause. He ignores her. He did not answer her a word. That is not the Jesus I grew up learning about. That is not the Jesus that I have known to act in my own life. I have never known Jesus to ignore me when I needed him. And so reading that is hard. It's hard to read something where Jesus ignores a woman asking for help. And so why is it there, right? And I want you to keep this in your mind as we go through it. And I also want to provide the context here. He ignored her, and that's shocking to me. To Matthew's intended audience, that's what he should have done. This woman had no business talking to him, and so he keeps on going, right? It's just sometimes maybe if you're downtown and somebody's talking, it's better, just straight ahead. And that's not the best thing to do, right? That's dehumanizing in its own way, but we can understand Matthew's audience's expectation that he would do that. And so he does do that. And she persists. She persists. Even after the disciples ask Jesus, beg Jesus to send her away, which implies that she persisted a lot, annoyingly persistent, right? They beg Jesus, send her away. She's crying out after us. And crying out is not a pleasant noise, right? It's not a thing that you're yeah, I just love being around people and children who cry out. That's my idea of peace. Great. And so the disciples were annoyed, and so they begged Jesus, send her away. Oh my gosh. And he answers, both them and her, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's another thing that is not the Jesus I know. If I have a friend who's suffering, I tell them to go to Jesus, right? I don't say, well, you could go to Jesus, but he was sent for me and not you, so, right? That's not the Jesus I know. And yet he says it. And yet she persists. She kneels and says, Lord, help me. And he answered, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she answers him, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs. So she takes on the insult. She's like, okay, fine, I'm a dog. Even the dogs get crumbs. And Jesus grants her request and praises her faith. So lots of things there, right, that are challenging, especially the insult, the dog, right, calling her a dog. Again, not a thing that Jesus I know does. I don't ask for help, but he's like, you're a dog. And I'm like, okay. And but that's what he says to her. So why did Matthew include that, and why did Jesus say it? What is he trying to teach us in doing that? And when I was reading this, I thought, how much time should I spend on the insult? If I spend too much time, does it distract from the message of the passage, that really it's about her faith? If I spend too much time, will it leave people feeling uneasy? And I have to spend time on it, because I actually think it makes the image that Jesus is trying to give us stronger, the fact that he used that insult. And there are some commentaries that have tried, and they might have a point, they might be right, to sort of explain away the insult by saying, well, yeah, Jesus called her a dog, but it wasn't like the word that Jewish people typically use for dogs. He wasn't calling her like a dirty street dog. It was more of a pet. And it's like, well, it's not really better. Still not great. So again, why? And I think that's there for Matthew's audience, but also for us. I think that we need to have an image of Jesus helping somebody who nobody expected him to help. Right? I think that that's an image that can be encouraging to us when we're downtrodden and can humble us when we get a little bit haughty. And so I think sometimes we need to be told by Jesus, yes, my grace is available to the lowest person you can imagine. Yes, the person who hurt you. Yes, the person who you're trying as hard as you can not to hate. Yes, that filthy dog of a person, my grace is for them. And some of us might be feeling like that filthy dog of a person because of whatever. Maybe we've done something, maybe somebody has said something really hurtful to us. And some of us need to be told, yes, my grace is available to the lowest person you can imagine. Yes, even you. Even if you feel or have been told your worth is lower than that of a street dog. And so I think that strong language actually creates a beautiful image. And I love that. I love that that's there. And that's there for us on this side of the cross, and it would have been an even stronger image for Matthew's intended audience, because remember, well, we're offended at the insult. Matthew's intended audience would have been offended that Jesus talked to this woman at all, let alone healed her daughter and praised her faith. And so it's actually a really strong image of God inviting people from the outside inside. And God showing people who are already inside, hey, it's not just for you. And that kind of theme of inviting people outside, inside, it's not isolated in this story. It's not even isolated in Matthew. It's not isolated in the New Testament. It's everywhere in the Bible. That is the story. That is the whole gospel, outside, inside, through Jesus' work. Now, I don't want to keep you here too long, so going through every instance of it, I do. But one, I didn't identify every instance of it, and two, that would be like a year-long series as it is, and we're already kind of in one of those. So I'm just going to identify a couple stories. So it's in the parable of the prodigal son, right? Jesus tells us the kingdom of heaven is like the prodigal son. And so what's the prodigal son? A guy who goes to his family, says, you mean nothing to me, I just want your money, give me my inheritance, I want nothing to do with you, gets his inheritance, leaves, squanders it, ends up lower than a servant, cleaning up after pigs, and envying the pigs for their food. That's who he is. That's who he is. Outside the circle, the kingdom of heaven is like this family, outside that family. And so he comes back, humbled, head down, tail between his legs if we want to keep the dog image, and expecting rebuke. And what does he get? Not rebuke, celebration. Outside, in. It's in the story of the woman at the well in John 4:5-30. A Samaritan woman, again, woman and Samaritan, not great neighbors with the rest of the Jewish people. And Jesus not only speaks to her, not only shows her that he knows her life, but reveals that he's the Messiah to her before he does it to a lot of other people, to her. If that's not bringing somebody outside, inside, I don't know what is. It's in the story of the hemorrhaging woman in Matthew 9:20-22. A woman with a condition of bleeding. A woman, and this condition would have made her unclean, right? So cleanliness, Jewish law, if there's a fluid coming out of you, unclean. So it doesn't really matter what it is. If it's a fluid, you're unclean until you do the things that you need to do to become clean. So this woman has a condition where she's bleeding all the time. She's unclean all the time. And it says it's a lifelong condition. So she would have been ostracized for who knows how many years. Firmly outside, unable to be made clean because the condition that makes her unclean is just persisting. It's just happening. And so what does she do? She goes through a crowd. That's a risk. If you're unclean, anybody you touch becomes unclean. So you moving through a crowd, that crowd does not want you there. They do not, maybe they part like the Red Sea. I don't know, but they don't want you there. So she would have had glares at the very least, maybe some jeers, maybe some insults. And yet she does it because she just needs to get to Jesus. And so she gets to Jesus and she's just telling herself the whole way there, if I can just touch his robe, that will be enough. And that's really similar to the Canaanite woman. If I can just have a crumb, that will be enough. They had such confidence in who Jesus was that they're like, I don't need all of you. I just need a crumb. I just need to brush beside you, and that will be enough for me. That will be enough to change my life forever. And they risk everything to do it. And they do, and Jesus praises both of them. He calls the Canaanite woman faith great. He tells the hemorrhaging woman, your faith has healed you. The outside-inside thing, it's also in the Roman centurion story in Matthew 8, 5-13. Now, the Roman centurion, he wasn't downtrodden, right? Like position of power, but not inside the Jewish family, a symbol of oppression to God's people, right? And yet, so it was firmly outside God's people. And yet he goes to Jesus and he asks for his help. And he says, my servant is ill, close to death. Help my servant, please. And Jesus is like, all right, yeah, let's go to your house. I'll help your servant. And he's like, no, not my house. You are too great to be under my roof. I'm too lowly to have you in my home. So he humbles himself and he's like, I know what it is to have authority. I know that if I tell a soldier to go do something, he does it. And I know you have authority. I don't need you to come to my house. I don't need all of you. I just need your word. And so Jesus praises his faith, says the word, servant's healed, and then uses the centurion's faith as an example in contrast to the faith of his own people. Outside, inside, right? There are some trends there. And the other trend is the faith. All of these stories have people, not the prodigal son, most of these stories have people who have faith so great that they're just like, I just need a little bit. I'm so confident in who you are and what you can do that I just need a little bit of it. Just need a little bit. And that's in stark contrast to the disciples sometimes, particularly in the boat in the storm, right? And we were in that story, I don't know, time sort of like a month ago maybe? Does that sound right? Doesn't matter. A while ago, we were in that story. And if, just to refresh your memory, the disciples, a lot of whom were fishermen, they're in a boat on the sea, Jesus is asleep, and a storm comes up. And they freak out. They're panicking. They're convinced they're going to die, and they look to Jesus for help, and he's asleep. And they're like, we got to wake him up. And so they shake him. They're like, wake up, wake up, wake up. We're going to die. Save us. I can't, do you not see what's happening? And then he's like, all right. And so he saves them, but he rebukes them for their lack of faith, right? Stark contrast to how he interacted with people outside, bringing them in, versus people already inside. So what was it about the faith of those outsiders that was praiseworthy or noteworthy at the very least, compared to the faith of the disciples that was worthy of rebuke? And I think it really comes down to knowledge of who Jesus is and confidence in it, right? The people who just needed a crumb or just needed to brush by his robe, they were so confident that Jesus was enough that they didn't need to cling to all of him. They didn't need to wake him up and shake him. They just needed to, a little bit of him. The disciples had all of him with them all the time. They had seen his miracles. He was with them in the boat, and their trust wavered. They panicked because he wasn't awake, and so they thought they would perish. Their confidence in him was shaken. And so I think that is kind of what Jesus is showing us a little bit with all these stories of what great faith is and what small faith is. But I can't leave it there because it's sort of discouraging, right? What if I don't have great faith? What if I'm like the disciples? What if most of the time I'm like panicked? I'm like, I don't know, help me, I need to hear you right now. I need to see you right now. I feel uneasy. I feel like I'm going to perish. I feel anxious. What if I'm more like the disciples? Does that mean all I get from Jesus is a rebuke? Does that mean I'm failing? Does that mean I'm abandoned? The good news is it doesn't mean any of that, right? God, I say this a lot, and maybe some of you have heard me say this. I say this when I'm nervous. It's sort of like a mantra. God is not limited by my weakness. I am not important enough or big enough or strong enough to mess up his plans with anything I do. Jonah wasn't, I'm not. But it's true, right? God is not limited by the size of our faith. He's not. And we see that in how he interacts with the disciples. Yeah, he rebukes their faith. But do they die in the storm? No. He gives them what they need. He calms the storm, the thing causing them anxiety, and then he rebukes them a little bit so that they can build confidence for the next one. Right? He saves them and he teaches them. That's what they needed, so that's what he does. So I really want you to hear this. If you feel from these stories of great faith that you're like, that's not me, God will not abandon us. God will not abandon you when your faith is small. We can trust in him and echo a prayer I've echoed hundreds of times, maybe more, of the man in Mark 9:24 who says to Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. Then we can reflect on what makes faith great and try to cultivate it a little bit. And so when I think about what makes faith great, I think about those stories I talked about, but I also think about another parable, the kingdom of heaven is like, right? That kind of thing, or where Jesus says, children coming to me, like childlike faith, right? And the exact verse is, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think, okay, well, what is it about little children? What is it about their faith? And it reminds me of this devotion I read like 15 years ago maybe. I think it was about John Piper. I had trouble finding it, but it exists. I remember reading it. But I read it like a long time ago, and it was talking about childlike faith and receiving the kingdom like little children. And it was this story about teaching a kid to swim and how much trust that kid has in you in the water when they can't swim and you're teaching them to swim, and how that is like childlike faith. Without you, that kid drowns, right? And yet they go in the water. That's childlike faith. They may not always go in it confidently, but they go in the water. You are enough for them to overcome their fear of drowning and get in the water. And that's childlike faith. And it's not really like a really impressive story, like, oh, you taught a kid to swim, great. But it stuck with me for like 15 years, because I think, and I think it's maybe stuck with other people who've read it too, because I think we've been on both sides of that equation, right? We've been the kid and we've been the adult, most of us. And so I remember being a kid, being terrified of water, really scared of it, and then eventually getting my confidence up, and I was so proud of myself. I'd get in the pool and I'd go up to my neck, and I felt great because it was up to my neck. I wouldn't go deeper, but I'd go up to my neck. I'm like, I got this. And then I went to the beach, and I went up to my neck, and I felt great. But the beach has waves. And so waves came, and I was not up to my neck. I was underwater. And the waves kept coming, and I kept being underwater, and I was small, but I remember that terror. I remember that absolute terror, like, this is it. I am done. I can't get my head above water. I'm being pulled out, like, this is it. I'm done. And then in a break in the wave, I saw my dad, and I knew he saw me. And I knew that he would get me. And he did. Of course he did. He came, lifted me up, and I was saved. I was saved, and then I could go in the water again with my dad, not alone, but with my dad, because he saved me, and he would always save me, and I knew that. And I've been on the other side of it with my brother, little brother. I'm like 9 years older, Jacob, and I taught him how to, or I didn't, I helped teach him how to swim. And I remember he was really small. He must have been like 2, maybe younger. And I remember encouraging him to get in the water, and he was like, mm-mm. And I was like, you can do it. And I was like, what if I carry you? And he's like, okay. And so I pick them up and I'm carrying them, and I don't know if you've ever held like a kid and you think they're weak, and then this vice grip of a grip when they're like scared, right? Vice grip of a grip, I'm like, oh my gosh. And he's like holding me so tight because he's terrified. And it's as tight as I think he can go. And then I take a step further and the water goes up like an inch, and he's like, he's like more and more tight. And then I remember a shift. I remember talking to him and saying like, Jacob, I'm here. You have floaties on, and I'm here. Nothing is going to happen to you. Nothing is going to happen to you. I promise you, nothing is going to happen to you. And the vice grip loosens, right? And then eventually the confidence increases, and you can hold them out a little bit. And the fear gradually goes away, and they get confidence to navigate the water. And if that's not an image of faith maturing, I don't know what is. Right? And does that mean that we don't cling to God when we need to cling to God? No, if you're in a situation where you're not, cling to God, absolutely, cling, vice grip, absolutely. There's nothing surer that you can hold on to. But is that what faith always has to feel like? Is that what faith always has to look like? I don't think so. We can be like children knowing that if Jesus is in the boat, we're good. If we're with him, we're good. If he's in the pool, we're good. We can be like the Canaanite woman knowing that if we can just have access to a crumb of what Jesus can give, then we'll have all we need. We can be like the hemorrhaging woman knowing that if we can just touch his robe, we can be healed. And the good news of the gospel on this side of the cross is that through Jesus' work on the cross and resurrection, we have access to so much more than a crumb and so much more than brushing his robe. We have access to the fullness of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all the time. They're always in the boat with us. They're always in the pool. And so we will be okay. And that's it.